Everything has a crack in it. That's how the light comes in. Leonard Cohen. D'abord, bonjour à tous mes concitoyens, mes concitoyennes d'expression anglaise et d'expression française. Ça me fait grand plaisir d'avoir qu'il y en avait tellement ce matin. J'aimerais remercier Peter pour l'invitation, ainsi que Howard, et ainsi que pour l'organisation. Stalin was asked why he wasn't bribing electors. His answer was very simple. I appoint the people who count the ballots. It seemed to me that a better question would have been, why are you even bothering with elections? His answer presumably would have been, well, I'm seeking the veneer, the appearance of legitimacy because of all that I intend to do and all that I am doing. The present occupier of that house has a simple approach as well. He silences or eliminates the journalists who criticize him. He imprisons credible opponents. If you're in prison, you cannot be a candidate. And he selects the opponents who will run against him. And he gets 70% of the votes in a free and fair system. I thought I'd start by a brief definition of what democracy is. Well, it's two Greek words, and they mean people and power. Power to the people. Democracy. A brief history. We, Homo sapiens, have been around for what some are now saying 300,000 years. They were saying initially 150,000 years, now it's 300. It matters because my point here is going to be the rate of change at which democracy is evolving. Then we saw, as Tom Axworthy was talking to us this morning, the philosophers, the Greek philosophers. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention that related to this 300,000 years, we have the caves in Lascaux where we saw us doing paintings that Picasso would have been proud of. That's 18,000 years ago. So you see the progression. Then we have the Greek philosophers Tom was referring to. And not long after that, as he was indicating, we had what I consider to be the great trigger to the system, to democracy, and that is monotheism, at least in the West. I'm not familiar enough with the Eastern religions to comment on that, but in our Western civilization, monotheism was the big change. Because it related to the soulfulness of human beings, our soulfulness. And that led to the intrinsic worth of each and every one of us, past, present, and future. And that, of course, led to a concept of fundamental equality. We all have only one soul, but we each have one soul. But that means we're equal. But again, relating to the rate of change, it took us 1,500 years for somebody called Martin Luther to stand up and say, I protest. The unitary authority of the Catholic Church. I protest. That was the beginning of accountability in our world. It took us another 250 years or thereabouts for somebody to say, we the people, in 1779. 3 words in English. The French had 3 words as well. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. Then we have the United Nations Declaration in 1948, to which the main scribe was a Canadian by the name of Humphreys. I consider that not to be an accident that they chose a Canadian for that. But one of the definitions that has struck me is one that was written by Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar, the man who wrote the Indian Constitution, or recognized to be one of the main scribes. And he said, and I quote now, "Democracy is essentially an attitude of reverence towards our fellow men." That one resonated with me because it alludes to that fundamental equality and why we relate to one another. There are two broad purposes that I've identified to democracy. One of them is to choose our representatives, therefore choose our government, choose the political parties that will be in the House of Commons or an elected body. That is the we the people part. And the other one, to which others have alluded here today, a regime of rights and freedoms. Because just to have representatives doesn't cut it for a democracy. There has to be an ultimate purpose. Now, the essential elements of democracy, and I won't deal with them in detail, and I may miss some, but a lot of the other interlocutors here have been dealing with them. But one of them which was not mentioned is a functioning parliament with an accountable executive. That is essential to a democracy. By accountable executive, I mean a government that is accountable to the elected people. The debate that is being waged in Great Britain right now with the Prime Minister and Parliament and the Supreme Court of 11 members unanimously saying, "You did wrong." "Well, I don't agree with that judgment." Sorry, I don't care that you don't agree with that judgment. A viable and loyal opposition, which is part of that functioning parliament. I'm talking about the essential elements. The rule of law, alluded to, an independent judiciary. This was mentioned earlier this morning. And as I was saying, a regime of rights and freedoms. The right to vote, the right to be a candidate, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom from discrimination on a whole slew of grounds, the minority rights that are attributable to minorities, and another one on which I intend to spend some time, independent institutions, that is to say, of which Canada is a primary example. We were the first to establish an Auditor General, 1885 or thereabouts. We were well ahead of our time. The others are the different, I should have mentioned the judiciary to begin with, but the Auditor General comes to mind. All the different commissioners that we have, official languages, ethics, privacy, access to information, and I'm skipping a few, are essential to the functioning of this democracy. And I would suggest should become the model for other countries as well, and has become in some instances. But I wanted to spend a little bit more time on electoral management bodies, more particularly Elections Canada, because I was asked to deal with Elections Canada. And there's a book that was written recently, Constitutional Democracy in Crisis, where two authors, Michael Pal and Richard Albert, have written an article recommending and agreeing with a recommendation that there should be a proposed fourth branch of government incorporating these independent institutions. And they explore Elections Canada principally. And I was very pleased about that because it is a recognition of that primary importance of that first step towards democracy, free and fair elections. I'm not going to weigh whether the Supreme Court is more or less important. That's not the point. We know, what I'm finding out is that as you look at them, some of them are just as essential as one another. And if you have one lacking, your system is not going to be very good. Now, some attributes of Elections Canada, which I was amazed. I discussed this with people on planes. They don't know this. They just benefit from it. And I'm saying, okay, that's the way it is. But Elections Canada is a one-person commission. Nobody else in the world has that. But that's because we were established in 1920. We didn't think of commissions in those days. We had an Auditor General, a one-person, Chief Electoral Officer, one person, 1920. The person is appointed by resolution of the House of Commons. Most of them have been by unanimous agreement of the House, unanimous resolution. Now it's for 10 years. My tenure was 17. I could have gone longer, but time was up. You have to leave at a certain age, at 65 in those days. The Chief Electoral Officer is the only person who does not have the right to vote in Canada. And I was asked about that, and I agreed with that, even though it did deprive me of a constitutional right. Everybody else who's 18 and above in Canada has the right to vote. Prisoners, we used to exclude judges, they're back in. Prisoners are in with the famous Sauvé cases, a hero, and so far as I'm concerned, had to go at it twice. Removal can only be by majority rule in both the houses, both the House, the Commons, and the Senate. The Chief Electoral Officer has the statutory authority to spend money. That is to say, she wants to send a plane because the ballots are missing for 100 electors. It's $6,000. Yes, where do I sign? Yes, but it's not in the budget. Where do I sign? Don't talk to me about a budget. I've got 100 electors that don't have ballots over there. Where do I sign? $6,000. And I'm using an example of what really happened. Redistribution is done by independent commissions chaired by judges, supported by Elections Canada, a neutral body. But that's how we do it. We don't do gerrymandering in this country, okay? We control the money. I cannot tell you how few countries control the money. If the system doesn't control the money controls the system. It's as simple as that. We heard a little while back about corporations and how they invade everything. During election time, they don't. We control the money. We control how much you can spend as a party, as a political candidate. We control how much individuals give. And we post everything on the website. Everybody can verify it. We enforce our statute, because not much point in having limits on everything if no one is enforcing the statute. We've even thrown one MP in jail for having overspent by $20,000 on a $100,000 limit. That went right up to the Supreme Court that said, no, we're not going to hear this case. The commissioner investigates. By the way, the Chief Electoral Officer has never found anybody guilty of a crime against the statute in Canada. The commissioner who investigates has never found anybody guilty of a crime against the electoral statute. The Director of Public Prosecutions has never found anybody guilty either. Only a judge in Canada finds a person guilty of an infraction under the Canada Elections Act. Only a judge. Unless you, of course, say to the commissioner, I am guilty, please punish me accordingly. Now, what is lacking in this system, because I do have to talk about some of the things that are lacking about our electoral system, not the Office of the Chief Electoral Officer, but in part. We have a system whereby 40% of the electors decide on 60% of our representatives. That is the disadvantage of multipartyism. Multipartyism is a success. We allow parties to come up, even the ones that a lot of people, a tremendous number of people, do not like and do not agree with. And I say, come forth, meet the test, and be registered and run candidates. That way we'll see just how much support you really have. But that's what we have, a system whereby. Now, some people say, okay, so 40% gets you 60%. 40% of the electors get you 60%. So we have a majority government, so it's easier to govern, blah, blah, blah. Well, if you stop to think about it, it's even worse than that, because only 65% of us go vote. So 40% times 65% gives you 26 or 27%. So in terms of the electorate, one elector out of 4 has voted for a majority government. If you do the math, because 35% of us are not showing up. And that is another lacune to our system. Now, who's not showing up? Young people. There were 38% in the year 2000 between 18 and 24. That's when I triggered a research by Professors Pamet and Leduc to find out who is not voting. And they came back and said, young people. Only 38% of them are showing up at the 38%. That's now, at the last election, they were at 58%. Nice. No. 80% is nice. 65% of us show up at the polls. No, 80% is nice. We have a problem. Okay? It may be attributable in part to what I've just described, when 1 elector out of 4. They're opting out for a reason. It's not good for democracy that they have. The other problem that we have, of course, is what others have been alluding to, which is the web and all the Facebooks and all that stuff. Now, will someone please explain to me how come we have to beg Facebook to do certain things for us when we can just pass a law? How can we allow greed, Facebook and others, how can we allow unmitigated greed to allow a Facebook or whatever to show itself off as a social media place where I can tell my daughters what I had for lunch and send them a picture, which I do not do because I'm not on Facebook. But then they can turn around, okay, we have to pay for that, we'll allow some ads. Okay, so you're allowing ads, okay. But then the ads get to be specific. I love Lamborghinis, so I start getting Lamborghini ads, you know? Or the opposition to Lamborghini, competition. But then I find out that they're selling our data to companies that sell them to political parties, and they can profile me because they know who I like on television. You know, I watch the radicals, I watch the contestants, the contestatory people, that's what I like. So they'll gear their message so that I'll vote for them because they'll know how to twist that little phrase. But so I've become the product. They're selling me, and I'm not making 1 cent out of it. And I never even agreed. How can we allow them to do this? Why do we allow them? What is wrong with us? And that brings me to Pogo. Pogo said, "We have found the enemy. It is us. We allow ourselves to miss out on our youth. We allow ourselves not to have poor people vote. We allow the Facebooks of this world to get us to beg them to do the right thing instead of just passing laws that say this is how you perform. Now they want to be a bank. The governor of the Bank of England has said, well, I hope they're going to follow the rules about banking. Yeah, I hope they're going to follow the rules. We saw what happened to the first ones who did that. Chief Electoral Officer of Canada deals with 25 million Canadians. 25 million, and he deals with the right to vote and the right to be a candidate, which are not subject to the notwithstanding clause, and he deals with freedom of association and freedom of speech. And he deals with the right to vote of 25 million people. And any chief electoral officer worth his or her salt knows that the priorities are the electors, the candidates, the political parties, the third parties. Nobody else is in the game. The media play an important part, but they're not part of the chief electoral officer's responsibilities. I used to tell people they're not my friend, they're not my enemy. They're another order, they can criticize me just as they criticize anybody else. And I respond to their criticism. Legitimacy, because I needed to talk about legitimacy of elections. What are its elements? Legitimacy is a generalized public perception, basically, that says this election was okay. And that is fed by comments that are made or analyses that are made by the media, by political parties, and by candidates. And I remember having a group of international observers at our elections, and at the end of the election, the candidate that lost, or the party that lost, the leader's on TV and says, you know, so-and-so has won. My Mexican friend turns to me and he says, he just admitted that he lost, and he's not asking for anything. He's saying the election was fair. Yeah, that's the way it is when you have an established democracy with people who know the process was fair. Participation, as I was alluding to, is an essential element to legitimacy. And I, through my comments, have raised questions about our participation rates on both general and specific groups. And I wanted to talk about, finally, what is achieved by participation. What do we get when it's 60 versus 80? I'm going to talk about 80 or above, which is not that hard to expect. We get representatives who are recognized to be really elected by the people, therefore legitimate. We get out of that a government which is legitimate, an official opposition which is legitimate, and other political parties, the Greens, others, which are also imbued with a sense of legitimacy in the process. We get the acceptance of the results. When someone shows up at the poll and votes, they are prone to accept the results because they say, well, I voted, but most people felt this way. So I had my say. It's fair. So acceptance of results. The people who don't vote don't accept or refuse. They're just parasitic Democrats, citizens. And that is another thing that we get when we get citizens to participate and to vote. We get a manifestation of citizenship, what our Indian friend was saying, which I quoted. That is to say, a sentiment of caring and belonging to a society. A recognition that we are a group of people. And what we've all been talking about, a regime of rights and freedoms. Chow En-lai, and I'm going to end on this note. Chow En-lai was in Paris in the 1960s. I think it was 65, 66. First senior official of China to visit. And a French journalist asked him what he thought about democracy. And he replied, it was too early to tell. I don't think it is too early to tell. I think we have progressed far enough to understand that the human soul finds its expression in a full panoply of rights and freedoms. And that is what democracy is all about. Thank you very much.